Chesquext pesea, Tarren Luis Quest, Chis Galicha, Chanesta Sinyalam, in Pialt Zilamti Kotun Schlalchalt. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tarren Andrews. I am from the Flathead Reservation of Northwest Montana. I'm Bitterroot Salish from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of that reservation, and I could not be more happy or grateful to be here today. Like many of us here today, my professional trajectory has been profoundly shaped for the better by the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies and the Race Before Race collective. I'm honored to have been invited to join this chorus of important voices meditating on indigeneity and its resonances within and beyond premodern studies. It is especially gratifying to appear in a program fronted by the artwork of fellow CSKT community member Jean Quick-to-See Smith, who started her journey to the spirit world only a couple of weeks ago. I'd like to thank Scott Manning Stevens and the board for envisioning this program, Leah, and the rest of the team for bringing it to life, and of course, all of the staff whose labor is keeping us fed and hydrated in this beautiful place. In my time today, I'd like to pick up a thread from the symposium's description, which says that indigeneity, as we commonly use it today, is, quote, largely in reference to native populations of certain lands who have become minorities in their own countries due to the incursion of settler colonialism. While this definition of indigeneity is indisputably true, legally speaking, while this definition of indigeneity is indisputably true, legally speaking, to be indigenous is to be colonized, it's never sat quite right with me. So where am I? Ta-da. This is not how I experienced being indigenous growing up on the Flathead Reservation in Montana. Of course, we understood the devastating impacts that Euro-American contact had on our communities, but devastation, loss, lack, these were not definitional features. Actually being Native was always defined in the positive. It was about being in community, it was about being part of an extended kid network, it was spending time with our elders, it was being out on the land and playing pickup games at the elementary school basketball courts. It is this sense of indigenous that I seek to recover here in just a small fashion today. And I think I had pulled this, this is another work from Jean Quick-to-See Smith, and I had pulled this before I knew what the program was, but I feel like this image in particular, the quote at the bottom says, "In the beginning, a Motkin created Coyote and assigned him with defending, with protecting us." And I just think that for me, coming from the community that I come from, that image and that quote really defines what it means to be a Salish person. It means having been given a gift. It means having been given excess. It means being in kind of responsible relation with the world because of that gift. And it's not about what has been taken away from us in the time since Amotkin sent Coyote for us. I suggest that one way to recover this sense of indigeneity is by reassessing our understanding of settler colonialism as something that comes into being through the alchemy of indigenous European contact. I want to offer us a way to see settler colonialism not only as a structure predicated on indigenous elimination, but as a set of logics formed long before contact, driven to evolve in key moments by settler-settler competition. In short, my talk today attempts to reverse engineer the deterministic relationship between indigeneity and colonialism that's manufactured by modernity, as Scott was pointing out earlier. To give a brief outline of my remarks, I'll move from the specific, looking at two versions of the life of St. Oswald, to the generic, with a reflection on the use of colonization as a term in early medieval studies. And a spoiler alert, it's a term that really gets around. It has a lot of breadth and very, very little depth. And then I'll close with some thoughts and questions about how we can bring these ideas into our classroom. And I've warmed part of the front row already, but you're going to be just sort of forced volunteers briefly to hold something when I get to that stage. But we'll start with the specific. The Venerable Bede's version of the life of St. Oswald, as compared to Alfrich's retelling a couple of centuries later. In Bede's Latin version of the saint's life, which appears in the Ecclesiastical History, written around 731, Bede contrasts Oswald's piety with the apostates and heathen people who killed him. Let's see, am I where we want to be here? And in this 8th century version of the story, converted Christians are the heroes, while the unconverted, or apostates, are the villains. Those most committed to God are celebrated regardless of ethnicity, although to caveat that script, Bede does imply that the English are better suited to Christianity than the Britons, whom he criticizes for their, quote, bloodthirsty nature. After King Edwin's death in 633, Osric and Ænfrith, both English Christians, became rulers of Northumbria, but Bede tells us they quickly renounced their faith. He laments their apostasy and records that both were soon killed by Cadwalla, whom he describes as, quote, exacting just vengeance through unrighteous violence. Although Bede calls Cadwalla a barbarian, his account highlights a particular disdain for apostates, emphasizing Christianity's central role in shaping a common English identity. This version of Oswald's story, metonymic of the larger Historia project, presents a version of English history that shapes a pre-national consciousness. It provides an origin story that affectively unites the people of Britain under the banner of Christian fellowship, thereby giving them a past and a future on the island, both linked to and distinct from centers of Christianity on the continent. Oswald's story, popular enough to earn him notoriety in Britain, Ireland, and on the continent, was retold in about 994 by Ælfric, an English monk, in his Old English Lives of Saints. Ælfric introduced significant changes to the narrative that reflect a shifting political landscape. Written during a period of Danish incursions, Ælfric's narrative emphasizes ethnicity and territory over religion. Where Bede's account highlights faith-based unity, Ælfric's focuses on land and ethnic identity to define protagonists and antagonists, reflecting English anxieties about their status as settlers amid external threats. A close comparative reading of these two versions of Oswald's story, informed by critical Indigenous theory, shows how rhetorical shifts from Bede's emphasis on religious identity to Ælfric's vested interest in land occupation underline the formation of an epistemological relationship between English identity and territorial control, making the latter an inalienable metric of the former. Where Bede refers to people, places, and ethnicities, Ælfric replaces these terms with places. In Bede's version, Oswald requests help from Irish elders to help convert the English people after he assumes the throne of Northumbria, Scotorum in the Latin. But in Ælfric's version, Oswald sendeth a Scotlanda, sent to Scotland for aid. References to Picts nearly disappear from Ælfric's condensed story, with the exception of a directly translated line referencing the 4 nations that submitted to Oswald. In other places, ethnonyms that appear in Bede's version are omitted from Ælfric's. For example, in the Miracle in Bede's version, a Briton man finds the spot where Oswald dies in battle, noticing its exceptional greenness. And noticing its exceptional greenness, recognizes that, quote, some man holier than the rest of the army had perished there. In Ælfric's version, this man becomes a rider without ethnic classification. Where Bede's Oswald exists in a boundaryless, if not landless, world populated with groups waiting to be united in Christian faith, Ælfric's Oswald exists on a map, marked with boundaries, both cartographic and ethnic, that do not seem to be waiting for dissolution or resolution through faith. Although rhetorical differences might be explained away as personal choices, we must acknowledge the influence of political pressures in the 9th and 10th century for their impacts on Ælfric's version of Oswald's life. Scholars like Mary Kate Hurley, Malcolm Godden, and Gordon Watley have also commented on the particularities of Ælfric's translation, noting in their excellent and insightful work that his adaptations can be better understood in the context of shifting English identity in the post-Alfredian years of Benedictine reform. While it is undeniable that the Benedictine reform was a major influence for Ælfric, I suggest that when we adopt the vantage point of critical Indigenous studies, a discipline attuned to the nuances of English nationalism and its effects, we gain an even deeper understanding of his choices and their impacts. By extending early medieval English studies to include critical insights from Indigenous studies, I argue that narrative changes illustrate burgeoning links between national identity and territorial control that point to the formation of settler colonialism in the early medieval world. When we interpret these choices with the benefit of experiences of settler colonialism and hindsight, we can see how changing colonial circumstances in which the two authors wrote shaped their presentations of national identity and desires for recognition. And I evoke recognition here in the tradition of Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Sean Coulthard, whose book Red Skin, White Masks sort of articulates recognition as a political process of mutual seeing between colonized nations manifest sovereignty. In contrast, recognition between colonizers and colonized peoples reiterates colonial subjugation while permitting the denial of indigenous sovereignty, rights, and relations. But to get back to Bede here. For him, the notion of a united English nation doesn't exist, and it doesn't need to, since he's concerned with religious rather than national identity. In his narrative world, even kingdom names serve mostly to identify either already Christian or potentially Christian peoples. At this early 8th century moment in the development of Englishness, there is no secondary colonial threat, and therefore no need for nationalism, not even one that runs parallel to Christianity. Neither erasure nor elimination, key elements of settler colonial structures, as many of us know, these are not key parts of Bede's rhetorical program. He relies on ethnonyms, as he did when describing how Oswald sent to Irish elders for help with conversion, or in his repeated references to the Briton Cadwalla. Rather than erasing their ethnic identity or making them English, he seeks to subordinate their ethnic identity to Christianity. For Bede, a narrative of Christian identity establishes a unified community, while linking Britain to the wider Christian community on the continent. For Alfrich, however, the crucible of Danish invasion, what I identify here as settler-settler competition, necessitates a different narrative that supports a more territorial defined community and a national identity that is recognizable within English communities and threatens anyone seeking to displace them. Within this paradigm, saints and their stories give temporal depth to the narrative of Englishness and, when told correctly, create boundaries within which English Christian citizens are made. These saints and their stories shape a sense of English nationalism that, unlike Bede's history, invests in a narrative of unity that foreshadows cycles of indigenous elimination and erasure. Alfrich's strategy to avoid using ethnonyms, substituting them whenever possible with descriptions of land, gestures towards a desire of erasure and territorial acquisition. The downstream effects of the Danish invasion include the implicit idea that only the homogeneous nation is recognizable, which would go on to shape a global ecosystem of Anglophone empire and, by extension, settler colonial modernity. I contend that these emerging forms of settler colonialism involved alongside and within early medieval English identity and language formation. The traces of settler colonialism, its foundational logics, rhetorical structures, and articulations of power were preserved by settlers long before we named them as such. And now, to be clear, I'm not saying colonization happened. Saying colonization happened in early medieval England is not an outlandish claim. Indeed, colonization is not a novel term in medieval studies, especially early medieval English studies, which readily uses colonization and its cognates to describe waves of Roman, English, German, and Norman conquests that have punctuated the history of the islands. Given the tumultuous historical landscape of early medieval England, which includes episodes of cross-cultural contact, it is no wonder that so many studies of the period refer to colonization. But to be sure, these evocations of colonization are almost always done with little to no regard for the intellectual depth that indigenous and post-colonial studies have cultivated in their respective disciplines. In recent years, post-colonial approaches and pre-modern critical race studies have contributed new perspectives to medieval studies and its use of the terms colonization. But settler colonialism has yet to be given the same robust considerations because it's almost always identified as a modern phenomenon that emerged with Euro-Indigenous contact and serves as a critical entry point into discussions of modernity. In this formulation, the arrival of Europeans to regions inhabited by indigenous peoples marks the beginning of structures and systems that define settler colonialism, land dispossession, legal disenfranchisement, forced assimilation, and the ongoing project of indigenous elimination. This narrative has tied settler colonialism to temporal and ideological shifts that define modernity, Enlightenment thought, scientific rationalism, and capitalist expansion, all of which are said to originate in the sort of post-92 world. As a result, scholars have framed settler colonialism as a product of early modern empire, a function of Euro-Indigenous encounters that distinguishes the modern colonial project from prior forms of conquest or colonization, like those in the medieval period. Accordingly, settler colonialism's defining features were forged through interactions between European settlers and indigenous populations, where violence was justified by modern racial hierarchies, legal codification, and economic motivations. These assumptions about the temporal and spatial origins of settler colonialisms obscure the ways in which the logics of settlement, dispossession, and cultural erasure had already taken shape as epistemological frameworks in early pre-modern European contexts. By imagining settler colonialism solely through the lens of indigenous European contact, we risk overlooking the long history of European colonial practices predating the early modern period, and we reinforce a deterministic relationship between settlers and indigenous peoples wherein you can't have one without the other. Since the first legal definitions of indigenous, published by the United Nations in 1981, the term has referenced, oh no, did I go too far? Yeah. The term has referred to the experiences of settler colonialism. To quote from that 1981 definition here, indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories, their ethnic identity as the basis for their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal systems. That's just like never coming up at a powwow. You know, like no one, this is not what people are saying. This is not how we're defining ourselves. But I understand the need for a kind of international definition. While the internationally recognized definition of being indigenous has evolved in recent decades, and indeed the most recent UN definition has a lot more to say about self-determination, indigeneity, or the evolving characteristics that contribute to indigenous identities in settler colonialism, are still co-determined in popular discourse and imagination. Figuring settler colonialism as a product of indigenous European contact presents indigenous peoples as inadvertent enablers of our own colonization by rendering indigeneity a necessary medium for settler colonial growth. By extension, we become invisible as indigenous only through the experience of settler colonialism, despite an existence that spans eons beyond contact. But as I mentioned at the start of this talk, indigenous peoples do not define ourselves through settler colonialism. We do not define indigeneity in negative terms, not by the theft of our land, language, or lifeways. Of course, we acknowledge and mourn the absence of those things as we fight for anti-colonial futures, but we define ourselves in positive terms. We understand ourselves as indigenous through the presence of remaining knowledges, traditions, and relationships, what has always been and always will be. It is this sense of indigeneity that I seek to recover in my work by reassessing the historical contours of settler colonialism, so that we can uncover not only a structure predicated on indigenous elimination, but also a set of logics that formed long before contact as the result of settler-settler competition. This articulation of settler colonialism, rather as first produced by settler-settler conflict rather than through indigenous dispossession, represents a shift in both settler colonial and indigenous studies. In figuring settler colonialism as a structure and formation long before indigenous European contact, I hope to reinforce and make legible to a wider audience precisely what indigenous peoples already know. We are not products of settler colonialism. But how do I convey this in a classroom? Like most of us here, the research and writing that I do as like a academic does not really easily fit into the courses that I teach. Since I'm in a department called Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, I am tasked with teaching mostly Indigenous Studies courses. And I thought by way of transitioning from this part of the session where I talk at you to the part where we talk together, I'd like to introduce just a short activity that I do in my flagship course called Indigenous Thought and Anti-Colonial Theory, which is really just a sort of contemporary and historical survey of the field of Native American and Indigenous studies. And I organize it around key themes, so we don't move temporally or geographically, but around ideas. We begin with land, sovereignty, gender, indigeneity, tradition, etc. So we're gonna do this basically like I do it in the classroom. So if I could have a few people from the front row. Oh no. Okay, we need to start this at one end. You have to hold it. You're gonna be facing up, and then we're just gonna pass this down. Yeah, pass that down, everyone. You're gonna need to get involved, yeah. Thank you for being conscripted into holding this thing. So in my classes, we might need more than the front row. Second row people, anyone want to jump in? Yes. We have a piece of yarn. It is mostly green. I mean, it's quite long. Like, I don't know how long I made it. Anyone good at measurements? Anyway, it's mostly green. The last little bit turns yellow. What are we looking at? What is this that they're holding? Yeah, Jamie, say more. Yes, amazing. Thank you. So Jamie very kindly mentioned that this is a timeline. It is a history of the Americas that is sort of meant to represent indigenous presence in the place with the green string. And then at the very end, we sort of get to the moment of settler colonial encounter with the yellow. So you guys, if you can set the string down. I will wrap it up later. I just wrap it around this weird little rock. Thank you, everyone. A hand to my delightful volunteers. Okay, so for just maybe 3 minutes, if you could turn to someone who's near you, I'd like to ask you to talk about what the benefit would be of starting a class this way. It's just gonna be 3 minutes, and then I'll come and sort of wrap up my thoughts, and then we'll get to the whole group discussion. But if you just wanna talk to the person next to you for 3 minutes about why would I wanna start class this way? All right, everyone, I know a proper pedagogical technique is to wait for a lull, but I don't know that that's gonna happen with this group, so I'm gonna interrupt us. Okay, so if everyone could just briefly put a pin in the most interesting thing that you just discussed with your little team, that would be great. So just by way of closing, I'll say that this activity starts my thought and theory course primarily because one of the biggest challenges of that course for me is figuring out how to get this group of people to sit with a lot of cognitive dissonance, to sit in the kind of Keatsian place of negative capability, of shedding our settler colonial glasses, to simultaneously recognize the ubiquity and gravity of settler colonialism while keeping in mind the much, much deeper history of indigeneity in the place that we're in. This place, in my case, having really only been North America at this point, in terms of my teaching. So I follow up this activity with a short lecture that really emphasizes the indigenous presence in North America and tries to situate it in global contexts before sort of jumping in and getting into the specific terms and landmark events that students need to know how to proceed through the readings. So I'm not going to get into this intensely, but this is, we start here with this sort of timeline, which is just a digital representation of the thing that these guys were just holding. We talk about meadowcrofts, we get into some linguistic stuff, we talk about Pagani horsemanship. It's always really a wonderful time to show people, especially who come from maybe less rodeo context and Indian relay, because it's just so dope. We talk about Cahokia. This is one of my favorite things to show. If you're ever at the NMAI and you get to see these ducks, they are unreal. I mean, it's so unreal. And so getting students to think about craftsmanship as not just something that was like primitive, but in fact intensely, intensely specialized. We talk, of course, especially being in the East Coast, about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as the law of the land that we're in. So all of this is to say that what starting with this timeline does, what like holding the string does, what this sort of short lecture does for our classroom community, is it gives us something to hold literally that we can go back to when we get sucked into the just despair of settler colonialism. When we have these moments where we forget about the endurance of indigeneity and its independence from settler colonialism. It also gives us an object to play with throughout the class and a model for students to do similar kinds of projects. You could ask them, for example, to make their own timelines of a different place with different terms or encounters. And I find it a really beautiful way to end a semester by asking students to tie a new string to the end of this one and imagine themselves as beginning a new path and imagining a new kind of future. So to close out my part of the remarks today, I of course welcome any questions, comments, or thoughts about the talk, but I would also love to hear from you about what your small groups came up with in terms of why start this way. Or if you have thoughts about how you might want to adapt some of this in your own classrooms, thoughts about how we can engage the principles of our research in the classroom, even if our teaching subjects don't always match up with our research archives. I'm really happy for us to take this in kind of whatever direction we want to. But of course, I would like to, again, return to my deep gratitude and thanks for the team bringing me here today. It's such a pleasure and a true honor to be in conversation with you all. So thank you so much. I think we have microphones that are going to circle around. So yeah, if people have thoughts that they'd like to share. Yes, Ayana, please.
Thanks, Tarren. That was such a brilliant talk. I wondered if you could say more about how you handle the cognitive dissonance that your students inevitably will experience when a history that they have never been taught or encouraged to think about is presented to them in this whole new way.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think this is something that I'm relatively new teaching in the place that I'm teaching in now. And I think it's something that I'm still sort of figuring out, because in my previous sort of teaching experience, I taught at Salish Kootenai College for a while, and that's a student body that is, number one, almost always from CSKT or like other tribal communities, and they have a real sense of perhaps not like what other places might call facts, but of experience of what it is, and they so outnumber any non-Indigenous students in the room that you're sort of, you kind of like lean into the things that they feel and know. And then when I was teaching in Boulder, my entire time there, I had one student who was Native, and I taught 72 students a semester. That was crazy, and so that bar is very low to clear, and it's very easy to say, okay, we all have to get on the same page. But teaching in Connecticut now, my classes are really mixed. Like I often have kind of half and half, and that's a really difficult place for me to be in, and I've had to really think about what that means, because you of course don't want to put burden on the students who have lived experience to explain to the students who don't, but you also kind of want to try to bring everyone like along with you. And in that sense, I find leaning into the cognitive dissonance of the deep history and the sort of gravity of settler colonialism in the present moment a nice place to be, because we all sort of experience that, so it's like a common thing that we can kind of sit with. And I will sometimes return to this timeline if like things are getting really down in a class. I sometimes return to this timeline. It gives us a chance to like have something tactile. Carla just really wonderfully suggested having students like move around the room a little bit. I haven't done that, but I think I will. And then the other thing that I like to do is try to work not just with texts, which are kind of inherently being crafted post-contact, right? But like work with things like the duck decoys. I try to work with materials that remind us of the deep history. And this also has the sort of double benefit of teaching students how to do critical analysis of not just a text, but also an object. And so I mean, I think this, in summary to that, I do find the cognitive dissonance to be a place of commonality, of like, oh man, you know, even I grew up, you know, in a community, but even it's good for me to sometimes to be reminded of like how long we've been there, you know. So yeah, thanks so much for that question. Yeah, Sita, please.
So one of the ways that it seems to me that Indigenous ways of life have always operated independently of the settler context that's really important is Indigenous resistance, right? Particularly to, you know, settler-produced environmental disasters. So whether that's like no DAPL or many other, you know, deforestation protest or just sort of radical, you know, actions in forest. So I'm just wondering, like, how the approach that you're talking about, the, you know, the focusing on lived experience, thinking about the timeline, like, how does that help you to bring that aspect of like militant Indigenous resistance, you know, to settler colonialism into the way that you talk with students, especially given that like you teach at a really elite institution, you know? So I wondered about that context as well.
Thanks so much. That's also a wonderful question. I do sort of take this, I take that kind of head on. I obviously start with the, you know, with the greats with Nick Estes, with Leanne Simpson, with folks who have clearly articulated, you know, and done some histories of recent resistance. And I also really love to pair this with two books in particular. The first is Linda Hogan's Solar Storms, which is an outstanding novel and so easy to read, that is speaking about, that is itself a kind of history of resistance of the James Bay Company, but never says it explicitly. And so it is sort of grounded, it's these three women who kind of are going on a canoe journey to get further up north to understand what's happening to waterways down south. And that whole process is a massive act of resistance, of community building, of kind of like recharting paths that have been disrupted. But you never actually see the James Bay Company. You just kind of sit with these three women who are doing this on their own. And I think that's a nice way to pair work like Nick Estes's, which is such an immediate history of no DAPL, and the kind of people are literally on the front lines and encountering the military. So to show sort of the proliferation and the diffuseness of resistance as a project, that it can take all sorts of these different forms. But I do think it's important in my classes, I like to have both something like a historical text and a novel, something that's like a creative text, because of course so much of our resistance is coming from the kind of creative work that we're doing. And it's also a common, I don't have it so much anymore because students really opt into my classes. Like when they come there, they know they're taking an Indigenous Studies class. But in Colorado, the class I taught was just modern and contemporary lit for non-majors. So they had to be there, and they had no idea it was going to be a Native literature class, which was complicated in lots of ways. But thinking about like the environment was a way to sort of unify. So I often also only do half my syllabi at a time, only craft half my syllabi at a time, because you just sort of don't know like what the room's gonna be and what's gonna unite people until you have a sense of who's there. So yeah, thank you so much, Sita. Yeah, Jamie, and then Eduardo, and then Brandy.
Right behind you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I really like that exercise. I want to ask about the proto-settler colonialism, because it reminds me so much of that proto-race discourse we've had in premodern studies. And I just want you to theorize a little bit, what does the proto do in terms of understanding settler-colonial relations in Europe?
Yeah. For me, the proto is an important qualifier at this stage because for a couple of reasons. The first is that I do want to be attentive to the fact that although I am understanding the sort of logics is forming in this time and place, I am responsible to and care about a contemporary community that is experiencing settler colonialism in an immediate genocidal way, right? And so I'm not trying to equivocate between what happened then and what's happening now. It is not a one-for-one situation, but it is, there is a kind of cognate happening here. There is a sort of linguistic evolution, there's a cultural evolution that's happening, and so I want to be able to tease out this deep history without letting people who encounter the work fall into equivocation, because it's not equivocal. Like there's a problem that's happening now that needs to be addressed in the now. And while I think that the work that's happening in this room in spades contributes to imagining those sorts of anti-colonial futures, it's not the only way forward, and we need to, I think, remember to hold in tension those two things. And then the second is just, which is related to that, is how indigeneity is being weaponized. I mean, all of us here have sort of spoken about, I think in various contexts, the ways in which the far right is particularly trying to ground itself, especially an Anglophone far right is trying to give itself indigeneity from a kind of English national origin in the islands. And so I'm trying to resist that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think the proto is important for me right here and right now, and I don't know how long that will continue to be true. Like the discourse changes, the politics change. Our work is always sort of responding to the politics of the current moment, and that means that sometimes our rhetoric shifts. But for me right now, it feels important to make the distinction. Thank you so much for that question. Eduardo and then Brandy.
Hi, first of all, just thank you for that really wonderful talk. I loved your framing of the English response to Scandinavian arrival as a settler-on-settler contact, because I think it really then highlights a lot of the weirdness that we see in English text from that time period. Yeah. In particular, you drew attention to Alfred erasing the ethnic identities in his retelling of Bede's Life of St. Oswald, which to me, I think about what a big part erasure is of settler colonialism, and how, we know from other texts that Alfred was afraid of English culture being erased under cultural influence from Scandinavia, even in places where Scandinavia didn't have necessarily political control. They're like, oh, people are wearing Danish clothing and they're getting Danish haircuts, this is bad.
They're bathing, it's awful, yeah.
Right, they started to bathe once a week, big problem.
Yeah, terrible.
So I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit to, if you could speak more to the reaction and almost like knee-jerk reaction to erasure that the English are exhibiting in a lot of the texts at this time, or to any other interesting aspects that this methodology has kind of put light on that you've noticed that maybe you didn't have time to include in this talk, that we begin to see when we think of this as settler-settler contact under this indigenous methodology, as opposed to this kind of like migration methodology that's often employed for early medieval England.
Yeah, what a great question. Thank you so much. I think it's interesting that this moment of really intense textual erasure is happening almost is coming after, once the Danes arrive, the English sort of have to deal with them as an ethnic identity in that moment, and they can't really erase them. They can't erase the influence because there is so much happening linguistically, material, culturally, in terms of material culture, in terms of just culture, religion. All of these encounters are sort of happening in a way that are forcing the English to encounter them. And I think we see, especially out of texts that are coming from the South and the East, more of an erasure of British ethnonyms and these sorts of things. I think because they just desperately needed to erase something. It's like this strange, I haven't really gotten there, I haven't fully theorized, I'm really just spitballing. But I think that there is something psychologically and fundamentally broken about the need to we're confronted with this threat. We simply have to erase something that happened before. There is something that's compelling them to kind of make this shift. And it's not just wanting to have kind of continental links through the Benedictine reform. It's not just the religious aspects of it. There's something deeply personal that they're getting out of this erasure. And then we see sort of in the post-Norman conquest, we see a return of that, like Gerald of Wales writing. Like now all of a sudden we're really interested in kind of restoring a conquering mentality. And that continues on into the 14th century with things like the Vita Heroldi. So yeah, I haven't fully like fleshed that out yet, but it seems that there's something actually psychological happening and not just narratively kind of going on. So that speak to your really complicated and robust question? Oh, Brandy? One more? Can we do Brandy? Okay.
I promise I'll make it quick. Thank you so much.
So good to see you.
My question was about how in this really great string exercise, is there a way, and I'm sure because your students are already self-selecting, to avoid a narrative of teleology, like we go from the past to this like yellow-white present. I was just thinking because when I took a classics course on Mediterranean, early Mediterranean history, I had a professor who did something similar where she drew two timelines of Egypt and Greece, and she was like, stop thinking that this evolves from Egypt to Greece and then on to Rome and then on. She's like, all of these people were here at the same time, doing things at the same time, and they eventually cross. She's like, stop thinking of it as this like, when you're like in 5th grade and you get taught, it goes from here to here to here to here, and then suddenly we arrive in America with white people. Like, that's the thing that you sort of get taught, and I was just thinking, do your students react to the sort of linear time?
Yeah, you know, I haven't had this, I haven't had the sort of specifically linear framing come from students necessarily, and I do think that like I do that cold. So like students come in, sit down, we do a little icebreaker where they have to tell me what their favorite kind of Oreo is, and then I hand them that little ball, and I'm like, unravel this. And so there's no sort of context, but when I kind of step back and talk about what it is they're holding, I am not trying to frame it in a sort of, we got here now. I'm like, look at how deep this is. Like, look at the depth here. So I'm thinking of it more in a, like a latitude than a longitude fashion. And I then pair that, of course, with those slides that's trying to situate someplace like Cahokia in a broader scheme of things and is trying to point out like the sort of sad little population of London at the same time, you know, like thinking about that. So I do think that it's a risk, but I do try to frame it as like I'm not trying to talk about evolution here, I'm trying to talk about depth. And we kind of come back to that all of the time. Especially, there's Daniel Heath Justice's book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, is great for this, and sometimes I kind of pull sections of that for reading, because he's thinking about kind of contemporary Indigenous writers, but drawing on the fact that those story traditions are very, very old, and it's not an evolution of like an old story to a new story, but rather a continuation of these sorts of stories, and I do try to kind of like re-emphasize these sorts of things, versus the way that I talk about early medieval England, which is very much a kind of like things are evolving here, like there is a teleology to this place that makes sense in the way that we want to talk about timelines. The teleology is not relevant here for all kinds of reasons, and getting them to kind of parse that out is really joyful too.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Tarren.
Thank you all so much.